Hey, okay, let's keep going. Division 2, Chapter 3, the authentic potentiality for being a whole of Dasein and temporality as the ontological meaning of care. So, anticipatory resoluteness, the first section, we're just going to kind of wrap up that idea. And basically, Heidegger wants to just bring together here his idea of anticipation and resoluteness. So, anticipation was that being toward death, and resoluteness is that reticent self projecting upon one's own most being guilty, which demands anxiety of itself. So, resoluteness is it's basically it's projecting into those possibilities. So since it is that is what resoluteness is, it must therefore embrace the possibility of its impossibility. That is to say, it must embrace the possibility of its death. I've got a little quote which I'll read. So we revealed the primordial being of Dasein toward its potentiality of being as being toward death. Thus, resoluteness becomes a primordial being toward the ownmost potentiality of being of Dasein only as anticipatory. Lots of words there. It's like a word salad, right? But basically what Heidegger's saying is that we've seen the primordial being of Dasein is a being toward death. And that's that anticipation. And since resoluteness is it's a self-projecting into the possibilities that Dasein has, then resoluteness can be its own most potentiality of being of Dasein only in the sense that it embraces that idea of its own death, which is to say, only to the extent that it understands and acknowledges its death, and that is anticipation. So, to make a long story short, too late, I know, but resoluteness can only be authentic resoluteness if or in the mode of anticipation. So I think that's kind of the way to look at this. Heidegger sees anticipation as the mode of resolution, the mode of resoluteness, which makes it authentic. So resoluteness can only be authentic resoluteness if it is anticipatory. That is to say, if it is projecting towards its death, if it is a being toward death. So that's how those two things come together, anticipatory resoluteness. And I just have a quick picture, a diagram which I want to run by you. And you can see here that I've got anticipatory resoluteness there at the top, authentic being a whole, and we've got those two aspects. Anticipation is the being toward death, and there in that box on the left, I just outlined some of the things that we've looked at. And the resoluteness on the right side, the reticent projecting oneself upon one's own most being guilty, which is ready for anxiety. And there in that box on the right is all of those, the things we've talked about, conscience and guilt and all that kind of good stuff. And in the middle you can see that kind of feeds back into the care structure, which is the diagram I showed a few videos ago. So that's just a way to kind of get a bird's eye view, hopefully, of what we're talking about. So the next part, the next thing we're going to look at is Heidegger kind of revisits this idea of the circle in fundamental ontology. So we looked at this before, where we saw that there was a vicious circle in knowledge and interpretation. And the idea was there that there was no interpretation that is totally presuppositionless. So there's no untainted, no interpretation already untainted by, that hasn't been untainted already by some kind of knowledge. And Heidegger's response to that was, that's just the way it is, basically. And instead of trying to get out of that, avoid that circle, we need to get into it the right way. And basically he says the same thing here. So this time the circle arises because in looking for being in general, which is the task that Heidegger set himself, we have analyzed the being of Dasein. We've analyzed the being of Dasein to get to being in general. But in looking at the being of Dasein, we're presupposing the idea of being in general already, right? Because Dasein exists. It is. So there's already this kind of vicious circle that we can't get out of. So this circle, it can't be avoided because the existential analytic is not proving anything according to the rules of the logic of consequence. So we're not looking, we're not trying to investigate being, existence through kind of a scientific-based method or evidence-based approach, because those already, they're too surface level for what Heidegger's about. They already obviously presuppose everything that we're trying to uncover, right? So, I mean, science, evidence-based, the rules of reasoning and logic, they already presuppose everything we're trying to look at here, and so that's not the way that Heidegger is going about. So how is Heidegger going about it? Through phenomenology. That's our method in. That's our ticket in. And the difference between the phenomenological approach and, say, the scientific approach is that phenomenology is trying to get into that circle in the right way. It goes in knowing that there's a circle, but trying to understand the circle. Whereas science and a more kind of objective, materialistic approach tries to avoid that circle, and in avoiding it, it falls prey to the misunderstanding that it can be avoided. So that's basically what Heidegger's saying here. We can't avoid this circle, but through phenomenology we can get into it in the right way. And in the circle is in fact the basic structure of care. Dasein is always already ahead of itself, and it has always already projected itself upon possibilities of its existence. That is just what it means to be Dasein. You can't get out of that. And so there is always going to be this kind of vicious circle at the heart of any investigation into being. But whereas a different approach might try to avoid that, Heidegger's strategy is to embrace it and get into it in the right way, and then we can get a complete view, if you like, of the circular being of Dasein. So that's the circle in fundamental ontology. And now we come to temporality, finally. So temporality as the ontological meaning of care. That's where we're at. And so this is our first taste of temporality, and the next 3 chapters will kind of explore that in more detail. But as a preview or overview of Heidegger's idea here, we'll jump into this now. So Heidegger asks, what is the meaning of care? The beginning of this section. And he says meaning signifies that upon which the primary project is projected, that in terms of which something can be conceived in its possibility as what it is. So that's what meaning is. And so in looking for the meaning of care, what we're asking is what makes possible the wholeness of the articulated structural whole of care in the unity of its unfolded articulation. Another mouthful. But basically all we're doing there is trying to understand, go beneath care. So we've got the structure of care, that tripartite division of care, being ahead of oneself, already in, being together with. We looked at those in the first section, the first book, first division, first 6 chapters. And so now we want to know, how is that constituted? What makes up that structure of care? And so, like I said, we're just trying to go a level beneath that. What is care founded on? What is it built on? So, starting with care as anticipatory resoluteness, we get the idea that first, care is being toward one's own most eminent potentiality of being. So this letting come toward itself of the eminent possibility is the primordial phenomenon of the future. And so this is basically that first, we've got care divided into those 3 sections. The first part, being ahead of oneself, this is basically discussing that. So care in that first sense, being ahead of oneself, is that being toward one's own most eminent potentiality of being. And this is expressed, if you like, in the primordial phenomenon of the future. So I think that word phenomenon is important here, because what we're seeing, or what we are explicating here, is not time. So don't think about time as past, present, future. This is something completely different from that. So we're just looking at care, right? The being of Dasein. And in that first segment of Dasein, that being ahead of oneself, projecting, understanding, self-projecting into the future, or understanding, self-projecting, that gives us this primordial phenomenon of the future. So the future isn't a time which is at some point distant and will come to us eventually. This is what understanding, self-projecting is, phenomenologically speaking. So we're looking at the phenomenological sense here. Again, that's the avenue through which we're getting at this. It's all in a phenomenal sense. So Heidegger talks about this sense of future as being before and ahead of. And so those 2 terms capture the idea that Heidegger's talking about a phenomenological understanding here, not an objective kind of materialist approach. We're not looking at projecting as a something that Dasein does. We're looking at we're not looking at that first aspect of Dasein, that first part of care, as something independent of it, independent of Dasein. We're not looking at kind of what it means divorced from Dasein. It's a phenomenological approach, which means it is fundamentally tied up with lived experience. And so that's what Heidegger's getting at, I think, when he uses words to describe this like before and ahead of, instead of the kind of neutral term, if you like, the abstract term future, which sounds like a thing, right? Something outside of us. Instead of that, he's using words that kind of tie his idea of future with Dasein, that give it a perspective. So the future isn't something out there. The future is before, or it's ahead of. So it's connected with Dasein, because that's what this whole thing is. It's all connected with care, and care is the being of Dasein. So that's the first. As the first part of this, anticipatory resoluteness as being toward one's own most eminent potentiality of being. That's future. Future as before and ahead of. Secondly, care as anticipatory resoluteness understands Dasein in its essential being guilty. So this requires that Dasein be the throne ground of a nullity, which means to authentically be Dasein in the way that it always already was. And this Heidegger calls being its having been. And this is kind of, if you have to think of it in terms of time, it's like the past, right? So this is like it's kind of how that fits in. But again, it's not past in that the sense of kind of clock time. It's not that kind of past. It's past. It's having been as already, and so that's another. There's that word again which distinguishes this having been from past, as in time. It's what makes it phenomenological instead of merely ontic. So there's that's the second aspect, and the third aspect is care discloses the actual situation of the there in such a way that existence circumspectly takes care of things at hand in the surrounding world. Letting what presence is in the surrounding world be encountered in action is possible only in a making that being present. And this is the present in the sense of making present. And again, the phenomenological dimension here is it is making present in the sense of being together with. Ties it back to care, which ties it back to Dasein. So we've got those three aspects of care, and we saw how they get these. They have these ideas associated with them of future, having been, and making present. And this structure is temporality. It's what Heidegger calls temporality. And a kind of definition of it is the unified phenomenon of the future that makes present in the process of having been. And again, don't try and cash it out in terms of time. Think about it in terms of the being of Dasein, in terms of care. So this is what temporality is, and it's the meaning of authentic care, and it constitutes Dasein primordially. So this is not time. I mean, I know I keep saying it again and again, but it's really important to to understand this. It's not past, present, future. It has those. It does have the obvious parallel, but this is something that is nothing to do with that kind of clock time. If the meaning of care were what Heidegger calls vulgar time, then care would be conceived as a being that occurs and elapses in time. And anything that has that characteristic is objectively present, right? But Dasein is not objectively present. Dasein doesn't occur in time. This is temporality is something that constitutes Dasein. It's totally connected and woven into the structure of care. And Heidegger will even go a little bit further than that in a moment. But for now, let me keep moving. Care is not a being. It's not an individual. It's not a specific, particular being. And for that reason, neither is temporality. Care manifests in Dasein, and temporality does also. So again, this is a repudiation, I guess, of that way of thinking about time as something independent of Dasein. It's this temporality is, as I said, it's a part of Dasein. It's part of the being of Dasein. It's that's probably enough of that. So Heidegger has an interesting expression here too. He says temporality temporalizes itself. And the first time you read that, you're probably confused, to say the least. And the way I think we need to understand that is think of temporalize, the verb temporalize, to kind of mean articulate or break up, if you like. So when he says temporality temporalizes itself, what he means is that structure, that unifying structure, the projecting, the self-projecting that makes present in the process of having been, that whole unified structure, it articulates itself into those three, I'll just call them categories for now. Those three categories: future, having been, and making present. And what Heidegger calls them is not categories but ecstasies. And so it temporalizes itself, it articulates itself into those three ecstasies. And they articulate temporality, the whole kind of structure, in a similar way to the way that existence, facticity, and falling prey articulate care. So we already saw that care was articulated, broken up into those three aspects: existence, facticity, falling prey. And temporality, being broken up into its three ecstasies, is kind of the same thing. It's just the way it manifests, if you like. Now, okay, so temporality temporalizes itself. Temporality, a kind of interesting consequence of this is that temporality, since it's wound up so tightly with care and Dasein, is finite. Temporality is finite. But then you might have the thought, well, surely time continues even though Dasein is no longer, right? And of course that's true, and Heidegger would agree with that. But this is where our ontic and ontological distinction comes in again. This is clock time, world time continues. But temporality, which is always connected with Dasein, a particular Dasein, a specific Dasein, is finite, because their Dasein is finite. So again, it just reinforces that distinction between temporality and time. And I've got 5 things to note which will finish up this video. So it's kind of a shorter one. So anyway, 5 things to note. The first is these three modes of temporality always co-occur, is the word. So again, this is just to get you to stop thinking about temporality as being like some kind of progression, linear progression through in a sequence, which is how we think of time. These three modes of temporality always occur together. So you always have that futural self-projecting happens as Dasein is already in the mode of having been, or in the mode, it is as having been, I guess, and it's also being together with at the same time, making present. So those three ecstasies, they always occur together, and again, that's just because it's all tied up with Dasein and the being of Dasein as care. Man, how many times have I said that? I feel like anyway, it is important, so let's just say that I'm trying to emphasize that. The second thing to note, did I say 5? I've got 6. I've got 6 things I want to get through. The first was that they always co-occur. The second is that in Heidegger, the future has priority. So even though these three ecstasies, they co-occur, and they're all present at within Dasein as Dasein, the future is more important. It has priority. And this is because primordial and authentic temporality temporalizes itself out of the authentic future, and indeed in such a way that, futurally having been, it first arouses the present. So this is just I mean, it's just, that sentence is just Heidegger's way of stressing that that self-projection is I mean, we've seen it. It's kind of been at the core of everything. And for Heidegger, it is preeminent in temporality. And I guess you kind of understand where he's coming from. It's even when we are focused on the past, or when we all have a past, and that impacts us in the present, and even when we are doing things in the present, everything is, Dasein is still always already moving forward. It's always projecting into the future, no matter what it's doing now, no matter what it has done. It's always projecting forward. And I think it does kind of make sense, right? There is that, you can see what he's getting at when he says that this is the most important, if you like, of these three ecstasies. Dasein is, of course, it is throne, and it is being together with, but the way that temporality temporalizes is out or through an authentic future, through an authentic projecting, self-projecting. So that is just the key for Heidegger. And if you even think about his resoluteness, anticipatory resoluteness, we talked about resoluteness being anticipatory is what makes it authentic, and that anticipation is that being toward death, that projecting into the future. So even it has kind of a central place in his thought there in anticipatory resoluteness. So yeah, the future has priority. That's the second thing. The third thing is that temporality makes possible the structure of care, this unified structure that we call care. And that's probably the take-home point from this chapter. we've established that Dasein, the being of Dasein, is care, and we can even below that, beneath that, more primordial than that, is temporality. So the care is grounded in temporality. So this is now we're at bedrock, if I can use that word. And the fourth thing, the fourth, fifth, and the sixth thing I actually got from Stephen Mulhall's Heidegger's Being and Time, which is a great book if you want to further your understanding of this. But the fourth point anyway is Dasein doesn't exist in time but as temporality. Okay, we've covered that. The fifth thing, since care is an articulated unity, the same must be true of temporality. That's the fifth. And the sixth, the shift from time, which sounds like a thing, to temporality, which sounds like a condition or activity, is important because temporality is not a sequence of self-contained moments that move from future to present to past, but is rather a self-generating process which underpins the being of Dasein. I quite like that last point, and it's a good kind of summary. So this isn't a, Heidegger's not, I think, being he's not inventing terms just for the sake of it. This difference between time and temporality it's important to grasp, and he's not just like a lot of what Heidegger's doing. You can kind of accuse him, I think, of kind of kind of obscuring things with all of this new terminology, but it is fundamentally different. It's just a totally different way of thinking about human existence, and so I think that the terms are important to get to grips with, and this is one of the most important, the difference between time and temporality. So anyway, that's temporality. We'll continue in the next video with chapter 4 in division 2, and then we're going to get even deeper into time. So anyway, thanks for listening. Until then, I'll catch you next time.